Well, thank you very much for your very kind introduction, Professor Wang Ban. Colleagues and friends, last Thursday, my topic was Confucian humanism as spiritual exercise. Last Thursday, actually, next Tuesday, the title will be Confucian humanism as global governance. I'll be doing that with Professor Francis Fukuyama. And this afternoon, I will address Confucian humanism as scholarly inquiry. As some of you may have guessed, my intention is to offer three perspectives on the Confucian tradition, namely the Wei, which is rendered in Chinese as the Dao, and learning, that's Xue, and Zhen, which means politics. I entitle a collection of my essays on the Confucian intellectual as Dao Xue Zhen, Wei, Learning, and Politics. Actually, I took Christian studies as a reference. According to Professor David Tracy at Chicago, he offers a very persuasive categorization of Christian theology. The Wei refers to fundamental theology, learning, systematic theology, and politics, practical theology. So the Confucian learning refers to a way of life, a worldview, therefore refers to the core values. But it's also a very long and important unfolding of serious scholarly inquiries, but at the same time, it's also deeply involved with the practical world. So these three are intertwined as integral part of Confucian humanism. Spiritual exercise is my code word for the Chinese idea of Xiuzhen, self-cultivation, or self-cultivation philosophy. Scholarly inquiry for Confucian learning, specifically classical studies, Jingxue, and global politics, which refers to governance or practice. And this is very interesting. The current Chinese translation of the word economics is Jingji. And these two terms are deeply rooted in Confucian consciousness. Originally, it means Jing Shi Ji Ming, which means to manage in the world in order to help every people. And interestingly, now in the School of Economics at Peking University, they made a very, very elaborate say, we're not interested in profit making alone, we're interested in managing the world in order to help the people, which may be done, well, I hope it's not in jest. So managing the country and bring peace to all under heaven, actually, Tianxia. These three dimensions are inseparable in Confucian humanism. Together, they constitute a holistic vision of the Confucian way of life. There's clear priority underlying the Wei, learning, and politics. The centrality of the Wei is obvious. The worldview, life orientation, and core values define the character of Confucian learning and frame the context of Confucian politics. Without this idea, the core idea, then scholarship becomes formalistic. Without this core idea, then politics may turn out to be not very moral from the classical Confucian sense. Learning specifies that Confucian self-cultivation is not merely a quest for one's own spirituality, which you can differentiate the Confucian philosophy of self-cultivation from the Taoist on the one hand and Buddhist on the other. We can even say it's different from the Christian or the Islamic, because it necessarily involves an extended network of relationships in a very elaborate way to heaven, to earth, to sages, worthies, of course, the ritual practice and institutions of the past, as well as the question of one's own family, community, nation, and the world. In this all-inclusive spiritual exercise, learning is vitally important for both self-realization and social service. This reminds me that an eminent scholar at Stanford, Professor Richard Rorty, an eminent scholar, and once made a very clear remark in my presence that you have to make a choice, whether you want to be involved in self-cultivation or involved in social service. The two are in conflict. And because self-cultivation is time-consuming, it's all involved with one's own subjectivity. And social service is something which is external. You really have to make a choice. Of course, he made a choice, very clear choice. But anyway, that's totally un-Confucian. If you make that choice, you basically abandon the so-called Confucian project. Learning entails the acquisition of knowledge and the internalization of skills, as I pointed out before. Confucius himself grew up in a poor family. He freely acknowledged that in youth he acquired a great deal of mundane know-how, 多鄙视, many of the things that we normally don't want to do, chore in the house and so forth. His biographers also noticed that when he served as minor officials, he also became proficient in bureaucratic routine. And that's one of the reasons why there's a statement that in the Confucian tradition, no sage can afford not to be involved with the routine life of every human being. One scholar at Peking University once said the sages are so exotic, they have no knowledge about what's going on in the world. Of course, he has the Greek philosopher in mind. You know, one philosopher trying to find truth and with a lantern, and then he falls into the well without knowing why. And most of the philosophers are not mindful of ordinary things, but that's totally different from the Confucian idea. There's no indication that Confucius ever looked down upon those who did manual work. When students approached him for knowledge about gardening and farming, after he had devoted himself to classical and literary teaching for years, he asked them to learn from the gardeners and farmers. So many people say, look, he didn't want to teach them the important subjects. He wanted him to learn from the gardeners and farmers because he looked down upon them. This is often misinterpreted to imply that he despised those who labor with their hands. On the contrary, he simply instructed them to learn from people who were more skilled than he was. Just like, say, learn from the expert. Don't learn from me because that's not my particular profession. Even in the case of Mencius, because it's been the case being criticized by many eminent scholars, he made the distinction between those who labor with their physical strength and those who labor with their mind. 劳心,劳力. He did not judge that the work of the shi, these are the intellectuals, the modern translation intellectuals, or literati, some people rendered as the knights of the way. And one great translation by a Harvard PhD is ministers of the moral order. She's deeply involved in biblical studies, as you know that. In a way, he's not trying to say the shi is superior. This may sound contradictory. The context is very clear. These were involved in the debate with a physiocrat, those who believe that all values come from the land. Xu Xing, he said, look, the only value is cultivating the land. Even emperors should be involved in doing. You people are not cultivating the land, so you are parasites. You are not actually involved in real work. He was proposing, I think, a kind of Durkheimian idea, Durkheim's notion about the theory of division of labor. If you read that text, I think Robert Balla and others were fascinated by sophisticated understanding of division of labor. They said, look, you cultivate the land, how do you do that? Do you do it nakedly? No, we have to wear clothes. Okay, then you need weavers. You use it with your bare hands? No, we have to use instruments, so you have to have smiths. You just cultivate the land without doing any trade? No, we have to use the ground to trade for other things. So you're involved in the farming, in a kind of merchant activities. He reasoned that although intellectuals like him do not produce, we're not cultivating land like farmers, do not manufacture like the artisans, and do not exchange goods like the merchants. So normally, according to utilitarian calculation, we're useless. But they deserve respect because they are instrumental in helping the rulers to manage affairs of the state, to benefit the people. And they remonstrate with the rulers on behalf of the people when these rulers fail to do so. In addition, Mencius maintained, this is a bit mystical, that intellectuals have the capacity to enable the human world to flow in accord with the rhythm of heaven and earth. 上下与天地合流. Most of the people don't know what he's talking about, right? We may translate this mythic statement to imply that as contributors and creators of ethical and spiritual values, they, the intellectuals, generate and maintain the meaning of life for the human community as a whole. If we think the meaning of life can be exhausted by the farmers, by the artisans, by the merchants, you don't understand the importance of people who labor with their mind. If you do that, you know they created values, and these values make our life worth living. Learning so conceived is definitely more than the acquisition of knowledge and the internalization of skills. Confucius insisted that real learning is to learn for one's own sake. 古之学者为己. When I first proposed this to students at Peking University, I said, what do you think Confucius was arguing? Is it learning for the sake of the self or learning for the sake of others? They all say, of course, 为人民服务, learning for the sake of others. I said, that's not Confucius. Why? He insisted that learning for the sake of the self. In other words, it is learning to be human by ourselves, not because we're instructed to do so by our parents, not because we originally are motivated to serve society, or because demanded by the government. Not at all. Both Mencius and even Xunzi subscribe to the conviction that human beings are perfectible or improvable through self-effort. According to Mencius, we can do it because we are actually naturally endowed with the basic capacities, the capacity to feel, that's commiseration, that's ren, the capacity to will, that's yi, the willpower yi, the capacity to sense the world, that's civility, and the capacity to know, that's wisdom. Xunzi, on the other hand, contended that we must control and transform our insatiable desires by the self-discipline impaired actually by the cognitive function of the mind. Xunzi is saying each one of us can reason. Our nature is bad. If we allow our nature, jealousy, aggressiveness, and searching for food and sex and so forth, we will put much emphasis on that, the society will become chaotic. So we need to function the cognitive of the mind in order to control and transform our feelings. So some scholars said, like Mo Zhongshan, that style of argument is not at all in conflict with the Kantian mode of thinking. Kant also doesn't believe that human nature has the internal resources to do that, but nature is understood as passion. So you cannot rely upon passion. Adam Smith and David Hume believe the moral sentiments are necessary, but Kant, since you really have to have the rational mind to develop this categorical imperative. But anyway, in either case, in the Xunzi case or Mencius case, they both agree that the road to sagehood, what is sagehood? The most authentic, true, and real manifestation of humanity. That role is self-cultivation. The idea of the self, so understood, is an inner strength, or self, there's a certain kind of subjectivity. I know the postmodernists don't like the term subjectivity. They deconstructed it completely, but I think we need to introduce this term back in a new light. This notion about inner strengths is either generated from within, that's Mencius, or nurtured by forces or influences from the outside, that's Xunzi. The autonomy, independence, and dignity of the person are recognized as attainments by arduous and sustained spiritual exercise. You get it yourself. That's Xunzi, that Mencius' point. Xunzi, the first two chapters, one is learning how to understand the texts of the ancients, but also to involve in the transformation of the person in Xiusheng. these are not, the self-cultivation is neither gifts from ancestors. You may have fortunate to have all these great ancestors, but there's no guarantee you're going to be necessarily better than the others. And nor is it simply endowment from heaven. That's why heaven sometimes cannot help you. You simply want to do things devastating to yourself and to other people. This very famous notion, 天作孽，犹可逃；自作孽，不可活. If there are natural calamities, human beings can eventually survive. One of the great stories, of course, the sage King Yu was able to transform the flood, as you know, the Christian solution, or the Hebrew biblical solution is in the Noah. But in the Yu tradition, it's to develop an irrigational system based upon scientific observation, mobilization of people to do so. So they could turn a flood, natural disaster, into something beneficial to the human community. But if we can say a single individual, a community, or human species commit something, or commit something that is totally detrimental to their sustainability or liability or their viability, then nobody can help you. So human beings can be great creators, but also can be incredibly dangerous destructors. So this learning is much broader than the quest for one's own spirituality. Regulation of the family, governance of the state, and pacification of all under heaven, the statements in the Great Learning, are all implicated in self-cultivation philosophy. The idea of inner sageliness and outer kingliness, the so-called 内圣外王, as characterized by Zhuangzi, not by a Confucian, but by a Taoist, in his summary of the holistic understanding of Confucianism, of course succinctly formulated by Zhuangzi as the Confucian way, indicates that the things of the sages are intertwined and inseparable from the things of the kings. So there's nothing like render things that are gods to gods or render things that are Caesars to Caesars. The king's affairs are the affairs of the sages. In the Confucian world of learning, virtually all subjects of scholarly pursuit are included. The humanities, social sciences, and natural sciences. The idea that humanities are closest to human self-understanding, the sense of immediate appreciation of not only our way of thinking, but way of doing things, the literature, history, or philosophy, all subjects of humanities are immediately relevant to human self-understanding and self-reflection. And the social sciences are ways of understanding how human beings lived in the social context. The natural sciences are necessary for human beings to understand the environment in which we live. Now, this may be the reason people originally criticized that position as a kind of hubris. Ma Yifu, a great Confucian thinker, we didn't mention him as first generation of the revival of Confucianism. That's a major oversight. When we mention about the first generation, we always say Xiong Shili and Zhang Junmai, He Lin, and Feng Youlan, certainly people like Liang Shumin. So 5 of them. But the 6th one, Ma Yifu, probably is just as important, maybe in some way even more important than the others. Well, he made the observation that all Confucian learning is classical learning, and classical learning is so inclusive. It encompasses all forms of learning in a modern university. Now, people say this is ridiculous. But anyway, the argument is that the reductionist definitions of human nature are rejected. And sometimes, if you use Herbert Fingerat's notion, are not even rejected possibility. Rejected possibility, they never imagine or think about human beings in terms of a reductionist model. Human beings are not only rational animals, tool users, or linguistic beings. The definition of a rational animal in the Greek tradition, tool users in the Marxist tradition, or more recently, people are fascinated by our ability to speak. Therefore, we are linguistic beings. The Confucians very early on think human beings are emotional, political, metaphysical, social, aesthetic, and historical beings. I've used a rather straightforward method of illustration, or to illustrate the 6 classics in terms of the definition, the defining characteristics of being human just mentioned. This is, of course, outrageous from a very rigorous sinological point of view. This kind of analogy is open to all kinds of criticisms. I'm critically aware of that, but it's what the Buddhists would call a upaya. It's a convenient way of trying to underscore the point. The book of poetry, Shi Jing, typifies that human beings are emotional, endowed with deep feelings of various kinds. Interestingly, in English, you have these 2 terms, emotion and feeling, but in Chinese, qing. But the word qing, and any Chinese word that is made of a hard radical, has something to do with the emotionality or affectivity of the person. Numerous words, especially recently discovered, the Guodian material. I must say 50% or more of the terms we moderns cannot decipher. The feelings are so subtle. Maybe 5 different kinds of jealousy, right? 4 different kinds of anger and so forth. Very, very subtle. And that requires a lot of analysis. The document, or Sangshu, of course, refers to politics. Some people render Sangshu a history, but that's all about the governance of the sage kings. The Book of Change refers to human beings as metaphysical beings, ultimate concerns, searching for ultimate meaning. The Book of Rites, R-O-T-E-S, the ritual, refers to human beings as social beings. The music, which is unfortunately lost, but we can still find traces of that in the chapter on the Book of Music in the Book of Rites, and some remnants in the Book of Mencius, refers to human beings as aesthetic. And of course, the Spring and Autumn Annals refers to human beings as historical. Understandable in the study of 6 classics, they are considered the core of Confucian learning. The origins of all 6 classics predated Confucius by several centuries. And in other words, that's the reason Confucius is not the founder of Confucianism. In fact, the word Confucianism is a misnomer, right? You cannot translate back into Chinese, Japanese, or Korean. Recently, someone met me on the campus of Beijing University. She came to the States for a few years. She said, "You've been studying Kongzi Zuyi." I was very surprised. I said, "Kongzi Zuyi, what is Kongzi Zuyi?" He said, "Confucianism." Oh, I said, "Rujia." Rujia 不是孔子主义吗? No. Rujia is not Confucianism in that sense. Even though we want to use that term, it's now so popular. You cannot get rid of it. But the very fact the tradition is not focused on Confucius, the person, but focused on a tradition that he himself considered as inherited is very significant. You cannot imagine anyone who's more Christian than Christ, or anyone who's more Buddhistic than Buddha, or more Islamic than Muhammad. You can imagine, in fact you should, that a lot of people who are more Confucian than Confucius, such as the sage kings, right? And also some Korean scholars claim that Confucianism originated in Korea. And I had some very interesting anecdotes to talk about it. And there is an argument. Professor Liu Song-go, one of the great scholars in Korean studies, he said, you know, Confucianism began with Jizi, because we know in the Song Dynasty, this great minister was ostracized. He then left. He went to Dongyi. Dongyi could be considered an eastern country. So that's Korea, according to his idea. And Jizi is the one who developed what we call Hongfan Jiucou, the Great Plain, and the 9 categories. Confucius, of course, others inherited that great grandiose vision. So he probably, but we can say, well, there are people even predated Jizi. But anyway, a tradition that had lasted for about 1,000 years before the emergence of Confucius as a transmitter. So Confucius' self-definition as a transmitter truthfully acknowledged his indebtedness to the cumulative tradition of so-called three dynasties. In particular, the flourishing Zhou dynasty. That's why he dreamed of the Duke of Zhou. And this almost unconsciously trying to identify himself with that dynasty when he said, I must be old. For a long time, I haven't dreamed the Duke of Zhou. In other words, my great ambition is now not as intense as it used to be. The Duke of Zhou was Confucius' political exemplar and cultural hero. Confucius' creativity, I use the word advisedly, creativity lies in his amalgamation and fusion of the highly developed humanistic traditions. This is also true with a great Neo-Confucian thinker like Zhu Xi. These traditions, imbued with poetic vision, good governance, metaphysical wisdom, ritual practice, aesthetic sensitivity, and historical knowledge, provided Confucius with rich resources to construct, arguably, the most philosophical, influential, and enduring education legacy in human history. And part of the reason because Confucianism survived for a long time, right? Started with the 5th century BC, you can say even before then, and the spread of that influence in China, then in Korea, in Japan, in Vietnam, and of course overseas East Asians. And that tradition sort of had a start more than 1,000 years before the spread of Christianity, 1,500 years in terms of Islam, and certainly not as old as the Egyptian, Babylonian, and Sumerian, but these civilizations you really have to go to the Metropolitan Museum to appreciate the artifacts. They're not living traditions today. And so one way of looking at this is to look at the comprehensiveness of this particular way of thinking. The primary purpose of Confucian education is then to civilize the world through ritual and music. His basic curriculum consists of studying poetry and document, 诗书. He continued to study the Book of Change until old age. He said, if God, or not, he didn't say God, if heaven allowed me to have another 10 years, I would devote myself to the study of the Book of Change. Hopefully, my mistakes will become very few. And of course, he's presumed to have crafted a very subtle and inspiring commentary on the history of his native country, the state of Lu. This is what we call the Chunqiu. Later became a major scholarly inquiry throughout Chinese history. Many different schools. Kang Youwei, for example, in the 19th century, became a great interpreter of the Chunqiu of the new school. And then many, many scholars, Zhang Taiyan and others, became the interpreters of Chunqiu of the old school. And these two schools have been fighting even now today. The 1993 discovery of the 4th century BC Confucian documents in the Guodian. In this discovery, we're now talking about 30,000 characters with quite a few hundred bamboo strips. And I think it's easy to argue that the gap between Confucius and Mencius, Confucius 551 BC, and Mencius more than 100 years old, now being somewhat filled by these discoveries. Now we can hear the voices of great Confucian disciples such as Yan Hui, such as Zixia, Zizang, and a number of other people. So this is rather remarkable. Now, with the discovery of this particular material, the claim that Confucius actually edited the 6 classics and used them as texts for teaching his students to learn from the ancients, which of course had been firmly believed as to be what actually happened for centuries before the advent of critical scholarship in the 20th century. Now, the reason for this argument is that there's a text which started with the idea of he, meaning Confucius' commentary on the Book of Poetry. And a lot of people first doubted, that particular character refers to Confucius. But now I think it's general agreement Even those people who doubted it, such as Qiu Xigui, finally accepted. That's probably the case. So Confucius has something to do with the book of poetry. We have two quotes in the Analects that Confucius referred to the Book of Change. And of course, he's supposed to be the author of the Chunqiu. And many people believe that he may have something to do with the book of documents. And most people believe, I think I also believe, that Book of Rites is compiled later, not as late as Han. Jeff Riegel of University of California and did his dissertation on the Book of Rites and argued very forcefully that these things came together in the Han Dynasty. Now he totally abandoned that thesis, certainly as early as the 3rd or 4th century BC, around the time of Mencius. But is it possible for us to imagine even some of the references in the Book of Rites can be considered as contemporaneous remarks by Confucius? Confucius' self-definition as a transmitter rather than a maker is based on his conviction that learning from the sages is necessary for understanding the present and predicting the future. To know the past is not simply a kind of romantic assertion about a great period in the past. It is necessary for our understanding of the present and our ability to project the future. In other words, to retrieve the wisdom of the past is a precondition for comprehending the present and anticipating the future. In fact, some scholars have argued without memory, either personal memory or collective memory, then we're not free. Our personal and collective freedom is predicated on our ability to remember. And as we know, I think it's a very sad story. For more than 300 or 500 years, you see the more or less continuous, kind of continuous revitalization of the old tradition, interpretation after interpretation. But in the last 160 years or so, especially since the May 4th, not to mention since the founding of the People's Republic, the contemporary memory or the modern memory of China has been ruptured in such a way it's extremely difficult for modern Chinese students to remember what actually happened 50 years from now. They remember 2,000 years. They remember the Tang Dynasty, the Song Dynasty, but they don't know much about the anti-rightist campaign because Deng Xiaoping was involved, right? They know very little about the Cultural Revolution because even on the 30th anniversary of the Cultural Revolution, there's a government policy not to study it. Better from Deng Xiaoping's point, let's forget about the past and let's just forward with view to the future. And so even some people do not even know Tiananmen, May 4th, right? June 4th. But when they leave China and just, either to Taiwan, mainland China, to Taiwan, Hong Kong, not to mention Japan, Korea, and the United States, immediately that memory is being retrieved, and sometimes to everybody's surprise. So the historical memory is not just a vague, undifferentiated whole, neither an imagined utopia, nor a collective consciousness of what must have happened as a form of primitive communism. This refers, of course, to Confucius. Rather, it was an age fraught with upheavals, violence, and political tyranny, as well as innovation, tranquility, and good governance. In other words, a realistic understanding what is our past. It was also taken for granted by Confucius and his followers that there was a veritable account of what actually happened. They never considered history as a figment of the mind. It's something actually happened. We say, wow, they're naive. They haven't been exposed to modern critical scholarship. The historicity of the three dynasties, Xia, Cang, Zhou, was never questioned by traditional Chinese literati. Actually, in contemporary sinological scholarship, what I'm talking about only in the last 20 years, combined with the painstakingly assembled archaeological evidence, even astronomical data, oracle bone records, bronze inscriptions, and of course reliable historical chronologies, such as the Zhu Su Jinian. And Stanford is a great place to talk about this, because for the first time this Zhu Su Jinian is being accepted not only by scholars in the West, but scholars in China as an important source. And David Nevison, in his 90s, told me last time we met, he said when he lectured in China, some of his intimate friends said, look, from now on, don't mention Zhu Su Jinian anymore. People respect you so much. If you mention that, your reputation will be ruined. That was about 20 or 30 years ago. And now everybody believes that he's right. Together with his friend, and that's Shao Dongfang, librarian here. They really did a marvelous job. And most people now accept Zhu Su Jinian as an important source. So the Xia and Shang and Zhou, we all accepted Zhou, but we also believe the Shang, because of oracle bones, these are material evidence. Very few people, especially anthropologists and archaeologists, considered Xia something like a mystery. Was that simply the figment of the mind? But now it's interesting that many scholars, of course David Nevison is really in the forefront of this, all the sage kings, Yao Sun, Yu Tang, Wen Wu, in a way could be not necessarily proved, could be shown in a very persuasive way as actual figures. Here at Stanford, I mentioned we have David Nevison and Shao Dongfang's authoritative monographs on the Zhu Su Jinian. We also have Liu Li, who is an archaeologist, her meticulous work on the Xia. Once she mentioned Xia in her book, she became nervous because she's waiting for critical reflections from many other people. But Nevison, in a curious way, I would like to single out this case, dating the Zhou conquest of the Shang dynasty in 2040 BC. And his student challenged him, Pankania, dated as 2046. And the Sandai Gongzhen, the three dynasty enterprise organized by China with millions of investment, finally agreed with Pankania that 2046 may be the likely day. And I think David Nevison is still arguing that he got it right. Only 6 years difference. But even more fascinating was his recent claim that the founding of the Xia dynasty by the great king Yu, Yu of course, as you know, displaced Sun. And he put that day as precise as 1953 BC. And according to Liu Li's calculations, probably 2000 BC. They're quite close. But anyway, that's not my field. I simply want to demonstrate that a scholar with erudition, analytical power, imagination, and tireless dedication can come up with the scholarly contributions in a way comparable with, if not superior, to the research results of government-funded gigantic projects. Maybe the time is right for me to put this Confucian humanism as scholarly inquiry in the context, to situate it. And first of all, it's important for us to remember Confucianism is a transtemporal phenomenon. The historical consciousness is absolutely critical. That's certainly not true with Hindu ideas. I remember I was in Delhi, and I was fascinated by Kalidasa, the great poet. And I said, by the way, what century was Kalidasa? And they said, so what? The poetry is so eternal, so beautiful. 15th century, 17th century, 3rd century. Don't worry about it. But for a Confucian, in Chinese studies, if you say Du Fu was probably in the Song, or Ouyang Xiu was probably in Tang, well, you'd be flunked out of even high school, right? Now, Confucius' birthday, for example, give you the precision in which people are so nervous or not so concerned. 551 BC. There's no debate. The only debate for a while was the date. Either September 26, according to our calculation, Taiwan people say, or September 28. Now everybody agrees September 28 is the right date. Okay. Then you look at the dynastic history. Of course, under Confucian influence, every dynasty, ever since in the dynastic history tradition, is obligated to write an authoritative, comprehensive, hopefully not too biased account of the previous dynasty. So we have now 24 dynasties. And the largest project now in the People's Republic of China in the humanities is the Qing Shi project, to try to write the history of the Qing dynasty. And it's already over 100 million or more. And it's not only half done, maybe 25%. So it takes more than one generation to do it. Of course, there's also a project in Taiwan to write the history of the People's Republic of China. But anyway, it is politically charged, no question about it. And yet, when they do it, if you look at the Ming Shi as compared by the Qing, if you look at the Song Shi or Yuan Shi as compared by the Ming, and so forth, or the Wu Dai Shi as compared by the Song, in general, these are invaluable references. Highly politicized or moralized, but only to the end of the dynasty. The whole dynasty, in terms, meticulous detail, not only the biographies of the major figures, but geography, hydraulic system, ritual system, economic system, political system, all kinds of social systems. Very, very comprehensive, right? So the transtemporal phenomena indicates that the tradition has to be understood from a scholarly point of view in terms of different stages. And I would say you have to divide Confucian studies into at least 10 periods to get it right. The pre-Qing period, right? The Han. If you say, well, I don't want to make a distinction between the Xi Han and Dong Han, but the Han should be a separate one, and the Wei Jing period and the Sui Tang period, and certainly the Song, but don't forget there's also the Jin dynasty, very, very important. And the Liao, we know very little, but it's interesting to do it. And certainly the Mongol period, the Yuan and the Ming and so forth. And of course, in the modern period, we need to be more precise, not only the mid-Qing, but before the Opium War, after the Opium War, before the May 4th, after May 4th, before the founding of the People's Republic. After the founding of the People's Republic, you have to make a distinction between the pre-Cultural Revolution and post-Cultural Revolution. Now, so to make it convenient, easy to remember, I want to divide the whole Confucian tradition in terms of 4 epochs. The first epoch is a tradition, a local culture of the Qufu, of Shandong, over centuries evolved into the mainstream of Chinese culture. That's the first epoch from roughly 6th century BC to 3rd century AD. The second epoch, you can say from the 11th century, because in the interim period, introduction of Buddhism, for quite a while, hundreds of years, Buddhism became the mainstream of Chinese manifestation of Chinese spirituality. Confucianism was marginalized, even though Confucianism continued to be important as classical studies, as governance, as social rituals, or as habits of the heart. But the great minds, the brilliant minds, are all Buddhists. And then, of course, the revival of religious art, Taoism. But starting from the 11th century, the revival of Confucianism, we now use the term Neo-Confucianism, that the tradition spread from China to Korea, to Japan, and of course, much earlier actually, to Vietnam. So Confucianism by then is no longer a Chinese phenomenon, was an East Asian phenomenon. This reminds me of, I would consider tragic, but some people consider humorous, occasion with the great sinologist from Japan by the name of Shimada Kenji. He lectured at Peking University during the height of the Cultural Revolution, and of course on Confucianism. And he made a remark, as I learned for reasons beyond my comprehension, that Confucius was denounced as an obstacle to China's modernization. Of course, the denunciation is much more mundane than simply that. All kinds of cursing words were used. So we in Tokyo will have to work harder to underscore the positive aspects of the Confucian culture. Of course, when he made that statement, many scholars in China were moved, but at the same time, not humiliated, very saddened by the fact that our own cultural hero is now not being studied by us, but being really studied by Japanese sinologists. Not only a trans-temporal tradition, but also its cross-culture, which is implicated in terms of the second generation. Korea, Japan, and Vietnam can all be considered as part of the Confucian world. If you find elements within the Chinese cultural tradition, you cannot just assume it is Confucianism in a holistic way. So my assumption is this. In cultural China, that's to look at China, not just politically, economically. Confucian tradition is one of the many, many spiritual traditions. Taoism, Buddhism, legalism, folk traditions, yin-yang school, and many, many other traditions. Confucianism is only one of the many. Historically, that's the case. Geographically, that's the case. But if you focus your attention on the Confucian tradition, no matter how you broaden the scope of cultural China, it cannot encompass it, because it's also Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, and so forth. So who has the right to claim an interpretation of Confucianism is not say, I'm Chinese, so I know Confucianism. And now I think it's better to say I'm Korean, so I know Confucianism. And the very fact that some of the Korean TV series become major attractions in China, I think a very important element that is the more authentic manifestation of China's cultural past, especially Confucian tradition preserved there. And I'll give you one a little bit complicated, kind of scholarly argument. I've done it a few times. Normally in Chinese studies, we assume that the Confucian tradition in the Neo-Confucian period developed from Zhu Xi to Wang Yangming. Zhu Xi was noted for the principle, Wang Yangming for the heart and mind. And not only this was historically the fact, because by the time of Wang Yangming, then Zhu Xi's philosophy was relegated to the background. And there were cases in the time in China that defended Zhu Xi against the Wang Yangming criticism, such as Luo Qingshun, such as Wang Tixiang, but they were not persuasive. So people just assume that historical development happened. That's true. But some scholars, extremely good scholars, some of my teachers, just assume that it's not only a historical development, it's a logical development. Because Zhu Xi's philosophy was flawed in some serious way, and Wang Yangming understood the problem. So in a way, Wang Yangming's philosophy overcome the Zhu Xi's defects. But in a counterfactual way, never happened historically in China. Just imagine at the time of Wang Yangming, some defenders of Zhu Xi, much more sophisticated than Luo Qingshun or Wang Tixiang. And in fact, they even understood what even understand what Wang Yangming is trying to do. And they defended Zhu Xi against the Wang Yangming charge by broadening Zhu Xi's scope of his philosophy and to accommodate Wang Yangming's criticism. This is counterfactual, never happened in China, but it happened in Korea. And that's one of the reasons why some Chinese scholars, without any really intimate knowledge about Korean history, say, it's very curious why there were two Zhu Xi schools, two schools all attached to Zhu Xi, developed in Korea. And if we begin to study Korea, Korean Confucianism, our image about Confucian scholarship would be fundamentally changed. Another example, one of the great debates in Neo-Confucian tradition is called the Goose Lake debate, 鹅湖之会, between Zhu Xi and Lu Xiangsan, these luminaries. First of all, we are not absolutely sure whether the debate took place. We're not absolutely sure. People believe, because the only record came from Lu Xiangsan, and Zhu Xi brushed off and didn't mention anything. And okay, let's assume it happened. What was the agenda? There's no way of understanding. We know they were involved in the study of the Great Learning. And Lu Xiangsan preserved a poem before the debate. And Zhu Xi didn't say much about that. So many scholars try hard, like Julia Qin, reconstruct what that debate was about. Now we have a debate in Korea. It's a famous debate called the 4-7 debate. If you are Korean studies, you know exactly what it means. It's the debate on the 4 beginnings of Mencius and 7 emotions. In other words, the debate between, let's say, feeling of commiseration and emotions of anger and joy. Are they the same or are they different? It's a fascinating philosophical problem in philosophy of psychology. Now, in that debate, first, Li Tuige, the great thinker I mentioned, talked about his understanding of that problem by referring to a diagram. And then one of his students challenged him by writing a letter, and he responded. And then the student challenged again. And he responded, finally said, okay, we agree, that's the case. Already 7 or 8 long, detailed reflections. We have the texts, right? Then, a few years later, another great mind called Yugo, he said, well, I'm not happy with that kind of reconciliation. So he developed his own idea. So the debates lasted for another 20 years and continue even today. From the 15th century, 16th century to today, you have rich documents. Each line, each argument is clear. I don't think you can find anything in China or anywhere about an intellectual debate that lasted for so long and so serious. And of course, I remember many years ago, I had the fortune of getting together about 5 or 6 scholars to read the text for a whole year. And these scholars are now all luminaries. Kuriyama, who is now the chair of the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations, and Kim Yong-ok, he's probably the most celebrated promoter of Confucian ideas, but also because he appeared on TV so many times, people try to say he's not interested in Confucianism, he's interested in himself. But in any case, he's a great contributor, and there are many others. So I think I urge you, if you're interested, to study it. But it's not only transtemporal and cross-cultural, but it's also interdisciplinary. This, again, is a very fascinating problem for scholarly inquiry. I organized what I call a structured conversation. A structured conversation under the sponsorship of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences a few years ago. It's entitled, a small book, The Confucian World in Perspective. In that scholarly conversation, scholars in East Asian studies, China, Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and of course people in other comparative studies from Europe and North America. Disciplines included history, philosophy, religion, anthropology, sociology, political science, psychology, and developmental economics. I may have missed a few. And in that debate, you have so many, not only images of Confucianism, but methodologies of studying Confucianism and approaches. A historian, for example, understands Confucian tradition as not just an artifact, but as something that may be relevant now, but you have to get into the historical roots to consider scholarly reliable. But the philosophers, for example, right now, many scholars looking at Confucian ethics from the perspective of Aristotelian ethics, we call it virtue ethics. So they look at the Confucian way in terms of when they study Mencius, they're not interested in Mencius' historical background. They are interested in Mencius' argument, the Mencius' basic insight. And anthropologists will not be interested in all these philosophical people. They're interested in how Confucianism practice ancestral veneration. Sociologists are more interested in Confucian contribution to social stratification. The political scientists were interested in Confucianism as an ideology, as form of authoritarianism, for example. And psychologists, quite a few of them understand Confucian self-cultivation in a psychoanalytical point of view, identity crisis and so forth. And even developmental economists, Professor Wang Ban mentioned Max Weber. They're all trying to find the functional equivalent of the Protestant ethic. They consider Confucian ethics maybe the functional equivalent, and there are a lot of interesting studies. So you really have to understand the tradition. Then finally, I simply want to mention the different levels. Rossman of Princeton once classified Confucianism into 6 different types. But I think I simply want to remind you different levels, at least 3. Confucianism as elite culture. So literacy is absolutely critical. If you are not literal, if you cannot read texts, you can never be a Confucian. But we should also remember Lu Xiangsan's famous statement. Even if I do not recognize one character, 无虽一个大字不识，也可堂堂正正做人. I can also be a human being in the fullest sense. So I can be a Confucian, learning to be human, even though I'm illiterate. Now we know some of the great contributors to the Confucian tradition, especially the transmission of the way, turned out to be illiterate mothers. And if you look at how the Confucian way got transmitted, ever since the time of Confucius, the role of the mother is not only indispensable, essential, but most prominent. A 17th century Confucian mother asked her son, that's Sun Qifeng, to study with the 2 fatherless sons of our culture. She referred to first Confucius. His father died when he was only 3 years old. Then the famous mentions his mother. And of course, we know Ouyang Xiu's mother, we know Yue Fei's mother, and many others. There's a study of contemporary Chinese leadership. If you look at the important politicians, entrepreneurs, scholars, the prominence of the mother as an educator is self-evident. Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek. Mao Zedong really hated his father, but he had such affection for his mother and say he, his mother, and a worker form a united front against the authoritarian control of his father. Right? Chiang Kai-shek's, we know very little about Chiang Kai-shek's father, but his mother's importance. Hu Shi's mother, and numerous other cases. Okay. But also, we don't confuse Confucianism with elitism. Confucianism, through the so-called morality books, Sansu. If you read morality books in China, you'll be impressed by its syncretic way. Taoist, Buddhist, all kinds of other ideas. But the main thinking is basically Confucian ethic. In other words, how to be a moral person. And the circulation of these books are just very difficult to imagine. One Jesuit father who traveled China extensively said, one book called the Taisang Ganyin Pian, the mutual responsiveness between the supreme law and the human world, that circulated in the villages in China probably doubled or tripled all the Bibles circulated in the West. And just one book, we're talking about, according to the Japanese scholars, Jiu Jing Zhong Fu, probably more than 3,000 items can still be identified. Now, so these people come on, just imagine a world in which, no matter where you turn, all the words, for the on the wall all turn out to be Confucian ideas. To be filial, to be loyal. In New Year's with the Chunlian, with the couplets, they're all that. And very different from what happened since '49. All the slogans turn out to be long life Mao Zedong, the importance of the party, and so forth. Something is changing. If you haven't been in China for the last 12 months, it is fascinating to see a major change now. If you visit Beijing, the most widely displayed slogan turned out to be the 8 characters. defining Beijing 精神, the spirit of Beijing. The first one, of course, is understandable, 爱国, patriotism. The second one is 创新, creativity. The third pair is tolerance, 宽容, tolerance. The fourth one is requires a little bit explanation called 厚德, thick virtue. This 厚德 actually came from the Kun diagram of the Book of Change. Kun, you know, this is exactly the motto at Tsinghua University, 自强不息, 厚德. Now, these 8 characters turn out to be defining what Beijing spirit is. And if you know the background, you're fascinated. Maybe more than a year ago, the Peking government decided they should define what the Peking spirit is. So they got together and came up with a suggestion, more than one suggestion. Then all the academicians, outstanding academicians from Beida, Tsinghua, Renda, all gathered together, 40 of them, tried to study it, and then offer their own alternatives. Then a much larger group of people, including mass media, government, and so forth, select this list, maybe 40 or 50, to about 8 or 9. Eventually, maybe 5 or 6 were put up for vote. And so when I came back from, I was on a taxi driver, and I said, yeah, this slogan. He said, yeah, much better than the old ones. And I said, this must have received more than 1 million votes. 100万. You know how many people are in Beijing? 1 million would not be enough. So which means several million people voted for this slogan. But that's not just Beijing, everywhere in China. If you go to Hangzhou, to Guangzhou, everybody is trying to define, almost like New Hampshire, the land of the free, right? And things of that nature. Just imagine if we do that in America now. New York is trying to define the New York spirit, Chicago spirit, Stanford spirit. Before you know it, all these biblical ideas and all these great ideas will come up. Right? Now, let me conclude with 3 observations. First is that it's important to recognize Confucian scholarship as classical studies. I don't have to elaborate on that. That's core. But in addition to classical studies, since Confucius was not the founder, nor Confucius was deified time and time again, but everybody recognized Confucius as a human being. You know, we know his biography. We know that he made mistakes. He angered some students. Students complained to him, and he apologized. You know, all these things. So he's not infallible. And as a human being, he tried to interpret all these classics. If Confucius had to do it, we must do it. So one great scholarship that occurred in China is interpretation. You know, we know how hermeneutics is important in the West. They came from the biblical studies. But in Chinese studies then, ever since the Han Dynasty or even earlier, people began to study the classics. Some of them actually became a little bit too elaborate. There's one guy who studied the 3 characters of the book of Sangshu, the book, and elaborated for 300,000 words, 30万, or 3万 or 30万. Anyway, 30,000 or 300,000 words, just 3 characters. This is, of course, this is also reflected in our modern scholarship. You know, the youngest Confucian thinker, some people consider him Taoist, is Wang Bi, who died at the age of 23. He wrote only a few commentaries. And one of the most celebrated sinologists in Europe is Wagner. Wagner, in his dissertation, in German, of course, first, talk about Wang Bi's little text of the Book of Change, more than 1,000 pages. This now is available in English, and it's been translated into Chinese. So he spent 1,000 pages to interpret no more than 3 pages of the original text. So that's scholarship, which is still going on. No, I'm serious. This is how this is going to unfold, this interpretive tradition. And in fact, the other one, I would call it 考据, which is philology. It's a careful study of texts, 版本, different editions, not only philological questions, but phonological questions, questions of etymology, everything. Last time I did mention about the Chinese character. Now in the Guodian, it's the character Ren, humanity, is written with the body on top and Xin below. This, of course, requires a lot of etymological study. Maybe 说文解字 made it wrong. Why? So there's a lot of study. And this, in fact, was so powerful in the last 2 or 3 centuries. No, at least in the last century. This is how scholarship is understood in cultural China and in sinology. This is the mainstream. This mainstream is based upon the combination of 2 traditions. One was the Qing scholarship of the Qianjia tradition. I don't want to go into it. The other one is Western sinology, especially European sinology, French sinology. It's normally called evidential learning. In other words, you don't speculate. Philosophy is totally relegated to the background. Religion is totally unacceptable. You basically study the text, try to show your great skill by demonstrating how a word, contextualize how a word actually functions. And of course, how the sentence actually functions. It's very tedious, extremely interesting work. I would say David Neveson in the last 20 years been involved in this kind of work. He said it's a detective work. Try to find when was the time when the Zhou conquest of the Song Dynasty occurred by using astronomical, bronze, and all kinds of other things. You really have to be erudite to be able to do that, this kind of work. And some scholars in the Qing Dynasty call this is Pu Xue, which means unadorned. It's plain study with no speculation. You're not allowed to do speculation. Speculation itself is not scholarship. And this very tedious work, and one good example of this is the great sinologist, French sinologist, Paul Pellier. We render in Chinese, the Bai Xihe. He's done work on the Zhenghe's maritime expeditions. You know how fascinating that was. 7 maritime expeditions starting from 1403 to about 1433. And the ship from Nanjing all the way to the east coast of Africa. When we say the Zhenghe ships, we're not talking about what Columbus used for discovery of America. That, by comparison, is 小巫见大巫. Now, the boats that Zhenghe may be 5 or 10 times larger, often with about 15,000 people involved in the whole trip, and not only mechanics, scientists, hydraulic engineers, but of course cooks, not to mention cooks and others, even historians. So now if you want to study the Southeast Asia, Malaysia and so forth, the earliest reports were either by in Arabic by merchants, or by Zhenghe's historians like Ma Huan. So it's very elaborate. And yet Paul Pellier was not interested in the thing at all. What he's interested in is dating. When the first trip began, when the second trip. I began to read his paper on Harvard Journal of Asiatic Studies. I was so bored. What is he trying to do? Oh, it's not the 3rd day, probably the 4th day. According to this account, maybe the 4th day. I'm not absolutely sure. So that kind of study. But that scholarship at the time, the French, because the French sinologists are so rich. They can become a sinologist because they don't have to worry about, like many of you and us, jobs. They have all the time, all the money to do things that are totally useless for simply gratification. And of course, philosophy may not be useful either. But anyway, even some of the great minds, like historian, like Chen Yingque, he's great, my hero, everybody's hero. And he studied Tang. Tang Dynasty is the dynasty where Buddhism flourished. Many, many schools, not just the Can school, but Tiantai, Huayan. So everyone he studied was a great mind, a Buddhist mind. But he ignored their thought. He wanted to study the political implications, institutions. And Tang Yongtong was very exceptional. He also did the same kind of scholarship, but he made one comment in his preface. He said, if I do not have this incredible admiration for these great minds, how can I spend so much time doing this tedious, useless scholarship? So he's trying to show this inner urge to understand their ideas, but in scholarship, you're not supposed to do it. If you do it, you are, well, if you're a professor, your tenure will be jeopardized. And after you got tenure, if you do that, you'll be wrongly criticized by your friends as not doing serious scholarly work. But one type of scholarship, I think it's absolutely necessary with a view to the future. Last time I talked about the possibility of a spiritual turn, meaning that philosophers began to take seriously their own spiritual traditions. Derrida's involvement with Judaism, Charles Taylor with Catholicism, and Hilary Putnam with his own Jewish thinkers. So when these analytical minds, they're all great technicians. They can analyze everything in a most remarkable, ingenious, and logical way. And yet they begin to retrieve some of the spiritual values. So I think for the Confucian scholarship in the 21st century, it is important to take what I call the learning of the heart and mind, 心学, absolutely seriously. We need to study Mencius in the same way we study Immanuel Kant and some of the great minds today like Levinas and others, and try to show, or to say that he didn't do that, to show the strength of his argument, not simply as historically significant. This is Levinson's distinction between two words, historically significant. If you put emphasis on the first word, which is only historically significant, no relevance to us. But if you put the emphasis on the second word, historically significant, which means the significance is of historical importance, but also of modern relevance. And how do you do that? I think this is a very interesting challenge. I developed one idea. I have to end with this. It's called 体知. Maybe rendered as embodied knowing. 体 is the body. Now in Chinese, all nouns can become verbs, right, or adjectives. So we're all familiar in modern Chinese of these terms, like 体会. You have to really 体会someone's inner idea, otherwise you don't really hear it. Some say 体验, right? And of course you have 体证, 体恤. There's just so many of them. The only way to translate these terms, not the only way, I struggle with it, and I use the word experiential, right? Experiential understanding, because experience becomes critical. That was before, that was a long time ago, before all this emphasis on the body occurred, only in the last 20 years again. So there's a very interesting notion. Zhuangzi used the term, you don't hear with your ear, but hear with your heart and mind. Don't hear with your heart and mind, hear with qi. Qi actually, in this case, almost like spirit. Now, in that sense, we may get the wrong impression that the spirit is more important than mind, and the mind is more important than the body. So some people say this is like Cartesian idea. Your body is totally irrelevant. You use the cognitive function of your mind, try to understand. But this is just the contrary. I think the contrary is based upon one assumption. The assumption is the assumption is that there's no mind that is not embodied. All minds are embodied. You cannot think without feeling. You certainly cannot will or cannot know without feeling. So your body sensations are an integral part of your thinking. Of course, in cognitive psychology and other areas, this is increasingly accepted. So that's the reason why Mencius said Confucius, or sages, only sages, are able to fully develop their bodily constitutions. So when they become so-called sage, it's not because their mind becomes intelligent, because their whole body, which means holistically, they've transformed into a different kind of being. But that kind of being is rooted in our ordinary sense of what a human being ought to be. So the ultimate meaning of life is realizable, or ought to be realized in ordinary human experience. And the kind of scholarship we do, hopefully, will not be simply hermeneutic and philological. They are absolutely critical. But also, I don't want to use the word spiritual, but also refer to the inner worlds or the basic philosophical assumptions of these scholars. That may be one of the ways of trying to study Confucianism in the 21st century. Thank you.